Hello everybody and welcome to the Redneck Catholic. Today I'm going to be doing something that I think is a little bit different than what a lot of people are probably used to seeing on Catholic YouTube. I'm going to take 8 of the most common atheist arguments, and of course this isn't going to cover every single atheist argument because every person has their own reasons for being an atheist, and there's probably thousands of atheist arguments out there. But I'm going to take 8 of the most common ones I've heard, and I'm going to rank them from what I believe to be the dumbest to the smartest. And this is going to be good on several levels. It's going to force me to be intellectually honest and to not just try to dismiss all atheism as just dumb, and accept that some of them are bringing up real points and respond to those points. And I'm going to have to distinguish between arguments that really are just kind of lower level of thought, not very good arguments, and ones that actually bring up real points. So that being said, I'm about to get started, but before I do, please subscribe to this channel. It helps me to reach more people, and please like this video. That's good for this video as well. And with that being said, let's get started. Okay, so argument number 8. This is the argument that I think is the least well thought out, the worst argument. And it's often phrased something like this: there are 3,000 gods. You don't believe in 2,999 of them, you only believe in one of them. Well, I just believe in one less God than you do. So this argument is very popular among like celebrity atheists and stuff, but it's really not that deep if you think about it. I mean, first off, it doesn't provide any evidence that God doesn't exist. It's basically saying, you might as well sum it up: I don't believe in God, right? I don't believe in any God. That's all it's saying. Because if you think about it, all the monotheists out there all believe in the same concept of God. We all believe in this concept of an all-good, foundational creator being that's eternal and all-powerful, etc., 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 that created the universe and sustains all existence. All monotheistic religions believe in this concept of a God. However, we differ in terms of, if you will, not what that God is, but who that God is, when that God revealed itself to humans. For instance, Christians believe that God revealed himself to humans in the form of Jesus Christ, whereas Jews, Muslims, and Hindus are all going to reject that notion. So I do think this argument misses several things. It tries to make atheism as just another bubble among many. If each bubble is the belief in a particular God, atheism just tries to insert itself as another bubble in there, Whereas in reality, you have all these monotheistic bubbles under one heading called people who believe in a foundational, all-good, creator, eternal being. And then you have atheism over here, which says that there is no such being. And all the people who believe in such a being just disagree on who that being is when it revealed itself to humans, or even if it ever did. So I would certainly reject this argument. I don't think it provides any reason not to believe in God. I don't see what evidence is presented here for not believing in God. It's just a really weak justification used by, again, celebrity atheists to explain why they don't believe in God. Okay, argument number 7. It's a really simple argument, and I'm just going to phrase it like this: faith is the enemy of reason. You have faith on one hand, which is just accepting things without evidence, and reason, believing things based on evidence, and they're in conflict, and we need to choose reason. And it's used, typically, I would say this argument is not used by the most advanced atheists. I think it's usually used by like new atheists, street epistemologists, just people like that who don't bring up the best arguments out of atheism. They're the people who bring up the more lower level arguments. But let me try to sum this argument up, because unlike the last argument, I said this argument can kind of be translated into a logical, coherent argument with real points, and I'm going to try to do that. So this argument runs something like this. Point 1, reason is desirable. Point 2, faith is opposed to reason. Point 3, therefore faith is undesirable. Points 1 and 2 are the premises of the argument, and point 3 is the conclusion. And I doubt anyone would argue that point 1 is incorrect. I think everyone agrees that reason is desirable. But I think the problem with this argument is in point 2, the idea that faith is opposed to reason. Because when you think about it, there's no real good reason or evidence to say that faith is opposed to reason. Atheists who assert this will typically do so on the grounds that faith means believing without evidence, but this is not how Christianity or many other religions understand faith. We understand faith, our definition of faith is just trust. Now, I can say I have faith in the United States justice system. That means I trust the United States justice system to decide whether a certain person is innocent or guilty correctly. And I could have faith in the United States justice system for a variety of reasons, both logical or illogical. I could say, for instance, I trust the United States justice system because I like laws. Okay, well, that's a dumb reason to trust the United States justice system. And that would be an illogical reason to trust the United States justice system. On the other hand, I could say that I have faith in the United States justice system because when I look back in history, I think it's decided the majority of cases correctly, and I think it will continue to do so in the future. And that would be a logical reason to have faith in the United States justice system. And you could I'm not saying that I trust the United States justice system or that I don't. I'm just giving an example here. Another example could be Coach Jimbo Fisher, right? I have faith that he'll lead the Aggies to victory. Well, I could have a number of reasons for having that faith in him, both logical and illogical. And the same goes for any institution, or any person. So religious faith is just faith in God or faith in a particular understanding of God. So you're going to have people who hold that faith for a variety of reasons because you have a lot of people who believe in God. And many of them believe in God for many different reasons. And some of those reasons are going to be logical reasons and some are going to be illogical reasons. There are plenty of people who go to church because their mama went to church and their mama before them went to church and their mama before them, so on back to all eternity. And so they'll use that as their reason why they go to church and why they believe in God. And that's not a really logical reason, but there are people who have believed in God for very complex and very intelligent reasons, or at least very logical ones that you can argue about and discuss with reason. St. Thomas Aquinas, Isaac Newton, Gregor Mendel, Georges Lemaitre, the guy who invented the Big Bang Theory. These were all people who believed in God, and they believed in God for a variety of complex intellectual reasons. And so they had religious faith on the foundation. The foundation of their faith was not just I'm going to believe in God without evidence. It's that I think I have enough evidence to believe in God, and that is my religious faith. And you can debate those reasons. Obviously, you don't have to necessarily think that they're good arguments, but they are actual arguments, and they're not just believing something without evidence. So I don't think this reason is I don't think it accurately describes what faith is. And I also don't think it gives any evidence that God doesn't exist. So it's a little bit of a step up from the last argument I said, because the last argument I said, really, there was no way to translate it into any kind of logically coherent reason why believing in God is bad. And at least you can translate this into a coherent, logical argument. It's just not a very good one. So with that being said, we'll move on to the next argument. Okay, argument number 6. This is probably one of the most dreaded arguments among people who believe in God, because they're tired of it, because it's kind of ridiculous, but people bring it up nevertheless. This is the dreaded flying spaghetti monster. This is a new atheist style argument, not used by the most intelligent of atheists. It's used by the ones like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, the new atheists like that, not your serious intellectuals. And it's mostly a visualization tool, I would say, to help non-atheists understand what atheists think about believing in God. It runs something like this.
Point 1. If something cannot be proven to exist, it is not real. Point 2. The flying spaghetti monster cannot be proven to exist. Point 3. Therefore, the flying spaghetti monster is not real. Point 4. Similarly, God cannot be proven to exist. Point 5. Therefore, God is not real. Now, points 1, 2, and 4 are the premises, and points 3 and 5 are the conclusions. But the argument could be reduced to points 1, 4, and 5, because the whole spaghetti monster in there is more of an example used. It's not essential to the argument. The central points here are points 1, 4, and 5. So if something cannot be proven to exist, it is not real. God cannot be proven to exist, therefore God is not real. The flying spaghetti monster in this argument is used more for illustration, comparing God to a flying beast made of spaghetti. Now, the problem with this argument lies in point 4, the idea that God cannot be proven to exist.
And the reason point 4 is the problem is that there are many logical proofs for the existence of God. Now, atheists might not accept these proofs, and they might come up with arguments against these proofs, but theists have come back and responded to these arguments, and atheists have responded to their responses, and it's gone on down the line, right? This is still an open discussion. You can't just say, oh, God can't be proven to exist and carry on without acknowledging that you have made a huge mental leap. And then the other issue with this comparison is that the flying spaghetti monster is something that, by all rights, if it is real, I should be able to see it and touch it, because the flying spaghetti monster, and I'm not presuming to know exactly what atheists mean when they say flying spaghetti monster, but I assume they're talking about some kind of flying animal that is made of spaghetti. And spaghetti is a real, not just real, but physical substance that can be seen and touched and eaten. I know this because I've seen spaghetti before. I know what spaghetti is. So I assume that a creature made of spaghetti could be seen. God is not a physical entity. God exists outside the universe. And we know that, the universe is all physical entity that exists. So God exists outside the universe. He is a non-physical entity. You can't see non-physical things. So if God were real, you would not expect to be able to see him. If a flying spaghetti monster was real, I would expect to be able to see a flying spaghetti monster because I know I can see spaghetti. I can't see non-physical things, so I wouldn't expect to be able to see God if God existed. So it's just a faulty comparison. And I do believe that the flying spaghetti monster is pretty much completely bankrupt. And with that being said, we're going to go on to the next argument. Okay, so argument number 5. And I'm going to sum it up like this. I only believe in what I see, and I haven't seen God. That's basically the heart of this argument. The person's saying that basically, if you want me to believe in God, show me God, right? And I'm going to translate this into a logical argument now.
So the argument can be summed up like this. Point 1, anything that cannot be sensed physically does not exist. Point 2, God cannot be sensed physically. Point 3, therefore God does not exist. The problem with this argument lies in point 1. And by the way, points 1 and 2 are the premises, and point 3 is the conclusion. It's point 1 where the problem exists.
Okay, so there are 3 reasons this argument, there are 3 reasons I say point 1 is problematic, which is a substantial amount. The first reason is that there are things that cannot be sensed physically that do exist, like our consciousness, like our thoughts, like our memories, like ideas, right? These are all real things, but they can't be grabbed and located in space. We can't put one under a microscope. The second reason is God is an infinite being, at least in classical theism, which is the theism of Catholicism. I can't speak for all other religions, but in Catholicism, God is viewed as an infinite being, and you can't. A finite being would not be able to see or process an infinite being because we cannot process infinity. So we wouldn't expect to be able to see God. The third reason is that God is viewed as an intelligent being with individual agency. So God could, if God did not want us to see him, God could make that happen, especially considering that God is viewed as omnipotent, all-powerful, and certainly as the creator of the universe in which we reside, God could ensure that we don't see him. And actually, there's a fourth reason I didn't think of earlier, and that is that in classical theism, again, God is viewed as existence, right? The opposite of God is to not exist in theism, because all existence comes from God. So you and your bookshelf and everything around you all comes from God. And so in that regard, a classical theist might argue that we do see God. And not in his entirety, because God possesses infinite existence, but we do see existence around us. And that, in the mind of a classical theist, is evidence that God exists. Now, you could argue that any of these points are incorrect, but I certainly think that some of them are going to be pretty hard to argue with. So I do think it is perfectly reasonable to say that even though we don't see anything that we recognize as God, it is still reasonable to believe that God exists. Okay, so the next argument, argument number 4, is turtles all the way down. And that's a kind of interesting name. I'll get into where it comes from in a minute. But before I do, I would like to say that we've crossed a barrier here from the dumber new atheist arguments that seek to just basically assume that God doesn't exist and not engage with theist reasoning. This argument does engage in theist reasoning. It's a critique of the uncaused cause argument, which I'll get into in a second. And so we've crossed a barrier here to theists who are a little bit more advanced and who are actually trying to engage with theism and prove it that it's wrong, rather than just dumb new atheists like the followers of Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, who are just trying to assume that God doesn't exist, and through huge mental leaps. So this is I want to give credit to this argument as an actual critique of theist reasoning, and it goes something like this. It's a critique of the uncaused cause argument. Now, the uncaused cause argument is the concept that everything around us was caused by something else. And I think we all agree that's the case, right? The chair you're sitting in was caused by um, a carpenter who made it, and the carpenter making it was caused by the fact that he was hired, and the fact that he was hired was caused by something else, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all the way back. And this goes for like, we have gravity because of the Earth's huge mass, and the Earth has a huge mass because this happened, and so on and so on and so forth. And the uncaused cause argument is to say, to avoid these causal chains going back to infinity, which they can't do because then there would be no beginning, um, which can certainly, now there are people who argue about this, but the premise of this argument is that that would cause um, a logical contradiction. You can't have an infinite causal chain going back forever and ever and ever and ever, forever and ever and ever, because then there would be no beginning. So this argument basically says that, well, there must be something that isn't caused by something else, and we're going, something to end that causal chain, something that just is, something that wasn't caused by anything else. And that's what we call God, and that's the uncaused cause argument. So turtles all the way down takes its name from an old Hindu fable, and that the earth is supported on the back of a turtle. And then someone asks, well, what's the turtle standing on? And then he says, well, another turtle. And then the person says, well, what next? And then the Hindu says, well, it's just turtles forever and ever and ever. So this argument says, well, if God is the cause of the universe and the cause of all these causal chains, then what caused God?
Here's how the argument runs. Point 1. Everything that exists must have been caused by something else. Point 2. God exists. Point 3. God must have been caused by something else. Point 4. That which caused God must have been older than God, or else couldn't have caused God. Point 5. God is not the oldest thing in the universe. Point 6. God is not the creator of the universe. Really, this argument goes on, but the point is there are things that are that must, if God exists, there must be things which caused God, or else God would not exist, and therefore God is not the all-powerful, eternal, supreme being that theists claim him to be. The problem with the argument lies in points 1 and 3.
And here's why I say that. Um, Theists who support the uncaused cause argument don't argue that everything has a cause. They argue that everything that has a beginning has a cause, right? The chair you're sitting in had a beginning, and the carpenter who made it had a beginning, and the wood that it was made out of had a beginning, and the soil that the wood grew in had a beginning, right? So all these things must have been caused by something else. And their answer to the problem of, well, where does all this go, is that there must be something that has no beginning. So if you say that God must have been caused by something else as part of your rejection of the uncaused cause argument, then you're missing the whole point of the uncaused cause argument. The whole point of the uncaused cause argument is that God is a being with no beginning that was not caused by anything else, right? God is the end of the causal chain. God is a being that does not rely on anything else for existence, a being that just is, right? And you can critique that concept, that God is that being, and I'll get into some of that further on down the line. But if you say, well, then what made God or what caused God, you're just fundamentally misunderstanding the argument. And so, while this argument does try to wrestle with theist arguments, it really fails to do so in that it says God must have been caused by something else with really no evidence or any reason for saying that, when the whole point of believing in God is believing in something that wasn't caused by something else. So when you ask, well, then what caused God, you're just missing the whole point of the argument. Argument 3, the God of the gaps. This argument basically says that as scientific understanding increases, as our understanding of natural explanation for various phenomena we see increases, our need for supernatural explanations for such things decreases. Basically, as evidence for this, they'll point out that, hey, way back in the day, people believed in a sun god, and that the sun was, Apollo riding his chariot across the sky. But now we've seen the sun and we know that it's not a god, it's just a big ball of gas that burns. And you can see, there are various other examples, people who believe in sea gods and tree gods, anything they didn't understand how it worked, they just assign a god to. And they'll say that scientific discovery increases, our need for God decreases, and eventually we'll reach a point where we'll completely be able to naturally explain everything. And even if we don't ever reach that point, it's clear that everything has a natural explanation behind it just because we've seen so many natural explanations for everything we've encountered in the past. The problem with this argument is that it ignores the difference between polytheistic, animistic, naturalistic gods that were just created to explain certain natural phenomena versus the theistic God, which is an explanation for existence itself. God is the all-good, eternal, some will say, the act of being. God is from which all existence comes from, sort of like in Exodus 3:14, where he calls himself, when Moses asks God what his name is, he calls himself I am. So God is just being. God is not just a supernatural explanation behind a certain phenomenon. You can't disprove the idea of God through science. Even if you proved evolution, which many today would argue has been proven. I'm not going to say anything there because that's another argument. But even if you were to prove evolution, that wouldn't disprove the existence of God. It might prove that Genesis can't be taken literally, but it doesn't prove the existence of God. That's the only effect it would have on religion would be on the Bible. It wouldn't affect the concept of God itself. Now, evidence for this is shown in the fact that for 2,000 years since Christianity has been around, if you go back and read the early church father writings, what you'll see is that the concept of God hasn't changed much. God is being. God is the source of all existence. God has been that way. God was that way in 100 AD, and God is still that way in 2000 AD to 2023 AD. And this is despite all the discoveries that have been made in the past 2,000 years. There have been so many scientific discoveries made in the past 2,000 years, it's crazy. Probably I would guess more scientific discoveries in the past 2,000 years than all the human history that came before it. And none of these scientific discoveries have disproved the existence of God. Many of them have been made by people who very strongly believed in God. Galileo and Nicholas Copernicus, the people who invented, both of those individuals were instrumental in coming up with the idea that the solar system goes around the sun and not the earth. They were both devout Catholics. Let's see, who else? Gregor Mendel, the guy who created genetics, or not created them, but discovered genetics. That man was an Augustinian Catholic monk. Isaac Newton, the guy who invented the concept of gravity and several laws of motion, he was a Christian. Trying to describe what exactly his theological beliefs were would be its own video, but he very much believed in God and believed that Jesus Christ was the savior of mankind. Georges Lemaitre, the man who invented the Big Bang Theory, was a Catholic priest. So Christians have always been at the forefront of science, and it hasn't really affected their faith in God. So I would have to say that this argument is just incorrect. More scientific discovery is not going to make people not believe in God. What scientific discovery could you make that would disprove the existence of God? maybe you could disprove a literal interpretation of Genesis, but you can't disprove the existence of an all-good creator being that is the foundational reality on which all of the universe and all existence depends. Argument number 2. And some might say that this is actually the best argument out there, and I know it's one atheists use a lot. It's very effective. I mean, if I were to take a guess, out of the people who left theism and became atheists, who converted to atheism, I would guess that out of the ones who converted to atheism for intellectual reasons, because of a certain argument they thought of or came across, I would believe that probably most of them were converted because of this argument. The idea of needless suffering. If God is all good and all powerful, then why does suffering exist? You can think of all the families who may have lost loved ones and become disheartened because of it, who've gone through tragedies, and they're like, why would God do this to me? And that drove them away from believing in God. Now, I'm not going to get too much into the emotional side of this because that is like walking on landmines, but I am going to try to break the argument down into a coherent, logical argument.
The needless suffering argument runs something like this. Point 1. God is all-powerful and all-good. Point 2. An all-good being desires for there to be no suffering. Point 3. An all-powerful being can prevent any and all suffering. Point 4. Therefore, God both can prevent and wants to prevent all suffering. Point 5. If God exists, he would have prevented all suffering. Point 6. Suffering exists. Point 7. Therefore, God has not prevented all suffering. Point 8. Therefore, God does not exist.
So, two big problems with this argument. The first is that it relies way too much on utilitarianism. After all, points 2, 4, and 5 of the argument only stand if utilitarianism is true. Utilitarianism is the concept that the best moral outcome is always the one that results in the least amount of suffering, or the greatest amount of, the greatest amount of material good. You want people to prosper and do well rather than suffer. God may value some things above a lack of suffering. God may value virtue above a lack of suffering. And I could talk about several virtues. For instance, courage. Courage cannot exist if there is no danger. If we do not have an understanding of what danger is, then we cannot be brave, because to be courageous means to be willing to face danger for good. So God may value the virtue of courage above a lack of suffering and be willing to allow some danger to exist so that courage can exist. Another instance would be compassion. How could you have compassion in a world where there is no suffering? If everyone's just living it up, then you can't feel sorry for anybody and you can't try to console them. And we don't have that compassion like we have in our world where there is suffering. So maybe God values virtue like compassion more than he values a lack of suffering. The virtue of resilience and determination and grit. How could that exist in a world without any kind of hardship? So God may value these virtues more than he values a lack of suffering. Another example would be, and this wouldn't cover every kind of suffering that people face, but it would cover some of them. God may value free will more than he values a lack of suffering. He says, okay, maybe this guy is going to take up a gun and start shooting people, and I could force him to not to. I could, make him not want to do that. But I believe that free will is more important than a lack of suffering. He wants his creation to have free will, to be independent. So God may allow him to do that. And so there are a number of things, and virtue and free will might not be the only things he values more than a lack of suffering. I can think of more, or I can't think of any more off the top of my head, but I'm sure that some people could think of more examples. And basically the idea here is that utilitarianism is wrong. The idea that a lack of suffering is the greatest good, that's incorrect. And to assuming that it is correct is the failure of this argument. In fact, in Christianity and Catholicism, suffering is even viewed as a good thing sometimes. Many orders of monks in the past have actually made themselves suffer by doing things like wearing crowns of thorns and stuff like that. They have purposefully made themselves suffer to get closer to God. And in fact, in Catholicism, if you haven't suffered enough, and if you haven't been made pure enough in this life, then, now this is assuming that you're a good person who's going to heaven. This is, people who are going to hell are going to hell. But people who are good people but are not pure enough in this life, they are purified in a purgatory, which is considered a stepping stone towards heaven. People are purified and made pure through suffering. So suffering is actually, and to explain the whole concept of purgatory would be a whole nother thing. But basically the idea is that suffering makes you pure so that you can enter heaven. So suffering is actually seen as some suffering is actually seen as a good thing in Christianity and Catholicism. So this whole idea that God would just be trying to prevent suffering is just wrong, at least from a Christian and more specifically Catholic worldview. And so that's why I toss this argument out. And finally, argument number 1, the best atheist argument, at least out of these 8. If you know of another one that you think's great, that's fine. I'm not saying that this is the end all be all for atheist arguments. This is just the best one that I can think of off the top of my head, and that is that the universe is the uncaused cause. So if you go back to that uncaused cause argument I was talking about earlier, this response to the uncaused cause argument is basically, okay, maybe all that's true, but maybe the uncaused thing at the end of all of the causal chains is just the universe, and the universe is the source of all existence. So instead of denying the uncaused cause argument, it says, okay, the argument's essentially correct, but the conclusion is that this uncaused cause behind all of existence is just the universe, and that it's the cause of everything in it. There are several problems with this argument. The first is that modern science, especially the Big Bang Theory, indicates that the universe did have a beginning. And the laws of thermodynamics state that it's going to have an end at some point. So, and there's not an infinite amount of matter, not an infinite amount of reactions that can occur. So if there's not an infinite amount of reactions that can occur, the universe does not have an infinite past, and it had a beginning, which means it's not uncaused, right? Remember, one of the assumptions of the uncaused cause argument is that everything that has a beginning has a cause. And so what I'm saying is that current modern science does not support the idea that the universe has been around forever and that the universe is uncaused. The universe had a beginning. The laws of thermodynamics state that there cannot be an infinite amount of reactions because it has to do with entropy. That would be a whole science lesson into that would need to be its own thing. But when it comes to the universe being uncaused, no, the universe had a beginning. It has a finite history, so it cannot be an uncaused thing. The other problem with the argument is that even if it were true that the universe was uncaused. This is pantheism, not atheism. Pantheism is the idea that the universe takes the place of God rather than nothing. And a lot of atheists would be like, okay, so I call myself a pantheist and that fixes that problem. Well, not exactly. Because even in a pantheist environment, it's going to look a lot more like theism than, or at least deism, than atheism. And the reason I say that is because the first cause has to have an independent will. The reason is because the first cause, and if you're not familiar with the first cause, a lot of this is probably going over your head, and you need to go study it outside of this video. I'm not trying to explain the first cause in the first cause argument in this video. If you want to understand the uncaused cause argument, study it somewhere else. And this whole video is basically being done assuming that you have some comprehension of the uncaused cause argument. But the uncaused cause has to have an independent will. And the reason for that is that it was the first thing to exist. Right? It's the only thing that has always existed. And so if it existed before everything else, then right before it caused everything else to exist, right before it started that first causal chain, it was the only thing around. So nothing else could have made it start the causal chain. It can't have been forced to by something else. It can't have been caused to by something else. It must have done it itself. Now, it must have done it independently, completely independently, because there could be nothing else influencing it at all, because it was the only thing that existed at the time. And what we see is things that don't have an independent will do not act independently. I mean, everything around us that does not have an independent will only acts when something is done to it, right? A cabinet only opens when somebody opens it. A tree only grows because of the sun's rays coming down on all kinds of unintelligent things. The earth only rotates around the sun because it is being pulled that way by gravity. None of the unintelligent things around us do anything of their own accord. They're all caused to by something else. So if the first cause could not have been caused by anything else, right? If the first cause could not have been made to create the universe by anything else, then it must have done so independently. And the only way it could have done so independently is if it had an independent will, which means that it has something of a consciousness. It might not be anything like ours, but it has an independent will. It is personal. It does things itself. It's not just another natural thing, right? It's not just like a planet or a law of gravity or something. This is something that is deciding to create universes. And because, again, it's the first cause, nothing else could have influenced it. Nothing else could have made it create the world because nothing else existed before. When nothing else existed, when this thing became the cause of everything else. So it must have done so independently, therefore it must have had an independent will. So even if you're calling it the universe, this is still an intelligent, eternal, all-powerful reality. So it's still pretty much like a God, and it's just also the universe. So I don't see how it helps atheists very much. But that being said, that's all the arguments I've got. That's all the ones I could think of when I made this video. I do not claim to have addressed every single atheist argument, and I was just ranking them I was just ranking the atheist arguments I knew. And I'm sure there are many others out there, and that's fine and great. But so basically, if you have your own argument, you can put it in the comment section, or whatever you want to do with it. You can go and look into that yourself. But I'm not going to address it in this video. Those are the 8 arguments I came up with for this video. So y'all have a good day. Like always, I'm going to end this video with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Lord, thank you for the gift of existence. Thank you for being the foundational reality. Thank you for choosing to become that first cause, choosing to start the causal reaction, the causal chain that has led to us being here and the world as we know it existing. We know that we depend entirely on you for our existence, and that if it were not for you, we would not exist. We thank you for this gift. And we pray that all those around the world who don't know you, who don't believe in you, might, when they think about it, become convinced and understand that you created all of us, and understand the beauty of theism and of believing in you. And we ask that they might be converted to Christianity and to the Catholic Church. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. That's all I've got. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And y'all, please have a good day.